On a Tuesday morning in April 2024, James Callaway sat in the most powerful seat he'd ever occupied. Not the corner office of Callaway Industries, not the private jet that had carried him. Across 6 continents, not the boardroom where he'd signed deals worth billions of dollars. He sat in a wooden chair before the United States Senate Subcommittee on Immigration Enforcement, a microphone 3 inches from his face, his board of directors watching on a live stream from a conference room 40 stories above Manhattan, and a decision before him that would either define or destroy everything he'd spent 40 years building. To his left sat his company's attorneys, sweating through their suits. Behind him sat his board, who'd made their expectations unmistakably clear. To his right sat a chair that was empty but shouldn't have been, belonging to the woman at the center of everything, a woman who was at that precise moment in an ICE detention facility in New Jersey, separated from her 2 children, 6 hours away from a deportation flight that would take her from the country she'd called home for 11 years. Her name was Elena Vasquez. She was a 41-year-old hospital cleaner from Guatemala. She had strong hands and quiet dignity and a laugh that her co-workers at St. Michael's Medical Center said could light up the darkest corridor. She was also, as far as the United States government was concerned, undocumented, a violation, a case number, a problem to be processed and removed, and she was the reason James Callaway was still alive. What happened in that Senate chamber that Tuesday morning would become one of the most watched moments in American political history. Not because of what James said, but because of what he chose to sacrifice in saying it. Because what his board didn't know, what his attorneys hadn't anticipated, and what the senators hadn't expected, was that the most powerful CEO in the room had already decided the moment he learned what the board had done, had decided the moment he understood the full weight of what Elena had given him on an ordinary Wednesday night 9 months earlier. This is a story about what happens when a man who has everything discovers the only thing that actually matters, about what it costs to choose right over comfortable, humanity over empire, gratitude over greed. About a woman who stopped to help a stranger in a hospital corridor and changed the direction of a life that had been moving entirely the wrong way for 40 years. And it begins not in a boardroom or a Senate chamber, but in a hospital hallway that smelled of industrial cleaner and fluorescent light at 11:47 on a Wednesday night in July 2023. James Henry Callaway had been building his empire since he was 22 years old, and he'd done it the way powerful men often do, by being willing to do what other people wouldn't. To cut the deal others found distasteful, to close the plant when sentiment said, keep it open. To choose the profitable path over the humane one, and then have his communications team explain why it was actually the right decision. He'd started with a small construction company, inherited from his father, grown it through aggressive acquisitions, hostile takeovers, and strategic alliances that served his interests until they didn't. By age 62, Callaway Industries was a $2.7 billion conglomerate, spanning construction, commercial real estate, logistics, and government contracting. James sat on 4 corporate boards, donated generously to political campaigns on both sides of the aisle, and appeared on magazine covers with headlines about leadership and vision. He owned a penthouse on Central Park West, a villa in Tuscany, and a ranch in Montana. He had what the world measured success by: wealth, power, and the ability to walk into any room and watch it reorganize around his presence. What he didn't have, though he'd stopped noticing this absence years ago, was anyone who would mourn him beyond the reading of his will. His 2 marriages had ended the same way, with women who'd realized they were competing with a company for a man's attention and had decided they preferred their own peace over his net worth. His adult son Daniel called on holidays and birthdays and spoke to James the way you speak to someone you've given up on but haven't fully abandoned. His inner circle was populated entirely by people whose loyalty was calibrated precisely to their financial dependence on him. He was 62 years old, worth $2.7 billion, and profoundly alone in the specific way that only powerful people can be. On July 19, 2023, James was at St. Michael's Medical Center in Newark for what was supposed to be a routine follow-up appointment. His cardiologist had been monitoring a concerning calcium deposit discovered during a physical 6 months earlier. James had scheduled the appointment the same way he scheduled everything, efficiently, minimally, with the intention of getting in and out as quickly as possible so he could return to the work that was always more urgent than everything else. He was walking down the corridor toward the elevator at 11:42 p.m. He'd stayed late for additional imaging that his cardiologist had ordered after finding something concerning when it happened. The first sensation was a pressure in his chest, so different from everything he'd ever felt that his brain didn't initially categorize it as pain. Then his left arm went numb, then the corridor tilted, then the floor came up to meet him in a way that didn't make physical sense. And then there was nothing at all. James Calloway, 62 years old, $2.7 billion, fell to the floor of the hospital corridor in full cardiac arrest and would have died there if not for the woman pushing a mop bucket around the corner at exactly that moment. Elena Vasquez had been working the night cleaning shift at St. Michael's for 3 years. She worked from 4 in the afternoon until midnight, cleaning corridors, mopping floors, restocking supply closets, doing the invisible maintenance that kept a hospital functional. She earned $18 an hour. She caught 2 buses each way, a commute of 1 hour and 20 minutes that she used to read the English vocabulary textbooks she'd been working through for years. She was working toward her GED because her daughter Sophia had told her she needed to finish school, and Elena was constitutionally unable to disappoint her children. On July 19th, Elena rounded the corner of Corridor 7 with her cleaning cart and found a man she didn't recognize collapsed on the floor. He wasn't breathing. He had no pulse. He was turning the specific gray-blue color that everyone who works in a hospital learns to recognize as the absence of life asserting itself. Elena Vasquez did not hesitate. She dropped to her knees, hit the emergency call button on the wall, tilted the man's head back to open his airway, and began chest compressions. She'd taken a CPR certification course 2 years earlier because her son Miguel had asthma and she'd wanted to be prepared. She hadn't used it since, but the instructions came back completely, the rhythm clear in her hands and her counting. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. She breathed. She compressed. She didn't stop. The cardiac response team arrived in 4 minutes and 12 seconds. Those 4 minutes and 12 seconds were the entirety of the distance between James Calloway being alive and being dead. Elena's hands had maintained circulation to his brain for 252 seconds. Not a moment of hesitation. Not a thought about whether it was her job. Not a calculation about what it might cost her. Just a woman on her knees in a corridor doing exactly what needed to be done because a human being was dying in front of her. The medical team took over. Elena stood back, breathing hard, hands shaking, watching them work. A nurse touched her shoulder and thanked her. Elena picked up her mop, righted her cleaning cart, and went back to work. She had 3 more corridors to finish before midnight. James Calloway woke up in the cardiac care unit at 2:17 a.m. He would spend 11 days in that hospital recovering from what his cardiologist called a severe anterior myocardial infarction. He received 2 stents, underwent multiple follow-up procedures, and was told in plain language that he had been within minutes of dying. When he asked what had happened, how he'd made it, the cardiologist told him about the woman who'd found him and performed CPR until the response team arrived. James asked to meet her, was told she worked nights and wasn't currently on shift. He asked for her name. A nurse, after some hesitation, told him Elena Vasquez. He said thank you and meant it more genuinely than he'd meant anything in years. He wrote it down. He wrote it in the small journal his hospital therapist had encouraged him to start, in which he was supposed to record things that mattered. Elena Vasquez, hospital cleaner, saved my life. He discharged himself 3 days before his doctors recommended, returned to work partially against medical advice, and for the next 2 months operated mostly as he always had. He sent flowers to the nursing floor with a card that said thank you to the staff of St. Michael's. His executive assistant handled the arrangement. He didn't send anything specifically to Elena because he didn't have her contact information and didn't think in those first weeks to pursue it. But something had shifted inside him in ways he couldn't fully articulate. He found himself stopping in meetings when he'd previously charged forward. He found himself sitting with decisions longer, asking questions about consequences he'd never cared about before. He found himself twice reversing decisions that his team had assumed were final because something about them felt wrong in a way he couldn't quantify. He was 62 years old, and he was, for the first time in decades, actually thinking about what kind of man he was. Then, in September 2023, one of his board members, Chief Operating Officer Philip Saunders, came to him with information. James, I know you've been asking about the woman from the hospital, Elena Vasquez. You should know something about her situation. Philip laid a folder on James's desk. Inside was a summary of Elena's immigration case. She was undocumented. She'd entered the United States 11 years ago on a visitor visa and overstayed. She had 2 children, both born in the United States. She'd been working legally under a work authorization that had lapsed. ICE had been building a case against her for 18 months. A final order of removal had been issued in August 2023, 30 days after she'd saved James's life. Her attorney had filed a stay of removal, but it had been denied. She was appealing, but the appeal was expected to fail. The timeline for removal was approximately 6 months. James read the file twice. Then he looked at Philip. What am I supposed to do with this? Nothing, Philip said simply. That's exactly what you're supposed to do with it. The Meridian Infrastructure Contract Renewal is in final negotiations with the Federal Contracting Office. It's worth $2 billion over 5 years. The administration has been cooperative, comfortable. If we start drawing attention to the deportation of undocumented workers, raising public profiles for people with final removal orders, we risk making ourselves a politically uncomfortable partner for the contracting office. We stay out of it. We say nothing. She was just doing her job. We sent her a check and we move on. She saved my life, Philip. I know, and you're alive because of it. But James, we are not an immigration advocacy organization. We're a $2.7 billion company in the middle of contract negotiations that will define our next 5 years. We send her a generous check. We stay completely clear of her immigration case, and we protect the business. That's what leadership looks like. James looked at him for a long moment. How long have you known about her situation? Since August. About a week after she saved you. You've known for 2 months. We've been managing the situation. James nodded slowly. Asked Philip to leave the folder. Philip left looking satisfied that the matter was settled. He'd known James for 14 years. He knew how these conversations ended. The business always won. What Philip didn't know was that James spent the next 3 weeks doing something he'd never done before in his professional life. He went looking for the full truth of a situation rather than the version that supported the decision he was supposed to make. He had his private investigator research Elena's complete background, not to find problems, to find the person. What he found changed him. Elena had come to America from Guatemala in 2012, fleeing domestic violence so severe that her medical records, which his investigator obtained through legal channels, documented 19 separate injuries treated in Guatemalan hospitals over 4 years. A broken wrist in 2008, 2 fractured ribs in 2000, an orbital fracture in 2011 that had required hospitalization for 4 days. The records told the story of a woman who had endured the unendurable until she understood with absolute clarity that if she stayed, she would die there. So she had taken her daughter, who was 2 years old and small enough to carry, and she had left. She'd entered on a legitimate tourist visa, crossed into New Jersey, where she had a cousin, and started over with whatever she could carry in 2 bags. She'd found work cleaning offices in the first month, cleaning restaurants in the second. By year 3, she'd worked her way into hospital cleaning, which paid better and provided health benefits, which she needed because she was pregnant with Miguel. She'd learned English from textbooks and from listening and from asking questions relentlessly, in the specific way that people learn a language when they understand that fluency is the difference between being heard and being invisible. She'd gotten her work authorization through a pathway available at the time and maintained it for 6 years, renewing carefully, keeping records, doing everything the system required. Until a paperwork error during a renewal process in 2019 caused a lapse that her then attorney, an overwhelmed man at a small immigration clinic who was handling 300 cases simultaneously, failed to catch in time. The renewal had been submitted. The fee had been paid. But a missing supporting document had caused the processing to stall, and by the time anyone noticed, the window had closed. 6 years of lawful presence undone by a bureaucratic error and an overworked attorney. She tried to fix it, had hired a second attorney, a better one, who told her honestly that the options were limited. She could apply for cancellation of removal, but approval required proof of exceptional hardship to USS. Citizen children and the immigration courts were backed up by years. Her case had been slowly working through the system when ICE had issued the final removal order in August 2023. She had 2 children. Sophia, 13, who was in the gifted program at her middle school and had told her school counselor she wanted to be a pediatrician, who stayed up late teaching herself algebra from YouTube videos because she wanted to be ready for high school calculus, who made her mother laugh harder than anyone alive, and who had, at age 13, more clarity about who she wanted to be than most adults. James knew at 62. Miguel, 9, who had significant asthma, managed with 3 daily medications, who played soccer despite it, who'd recently informed his mother that he intended to be either an astronaut or a chef, and hadn't yet decided which. Both were American citizens by birth. Both had never been to Guatemala, a country that existed to them only as a word their mother sometimes used when she talked about before. Both called New Jersey home with the absolute certainty of people who have never had reason to question whether home would remain. Elena was also, according to her co-workers and supervisors at St. Michael's, the kind of employee you built a workplace around. She'd trained 14 new cleaning staff members over 3 years, developing an informal mentorship system for new hires that the hospital's HR director had asked her to formalize into an official orientation guide. She'd identified a contamination risk in a supply closet 2 years ago, improperly stored chemical cleaning agents that were reacting with each other, slowly enough to be unnoticed, but dangerously enough to matter, that the infection control team said had likely prevented a significant respiratory incident among staff. She'd organized a food drive that collected 2,000 pounds of food for the hospital's patient support fund. She'd taught herself to speak limited Tagalog because a cluster of Filipino nurses had recently joined the night staff, and she wanted to be able to communicate with the newer arrivals who were still building English fluency. She was, in every measurable sense, exactly the kind of person you wanted to keep. Except that the system measuring her was not measuring contribution or character or courage. It was measuring a paperwork error from 2019 and a visa status that didn't match a form that had been filed 6 years earlier. James also found something that his investigator didn't need to tell him because he already knew it in a way that had nothing to do with research. When he'd been lying on that corridor floor dying, Elena had not performed CPR because she recognized him, had not done it because she calculated that a wealthy man's gratitude might benefit her, had not done it because she knew anything about who he was. She'd done it because a human being was dying in front of her, and she was constitutionally unable to not help. James Henry Callaway, 62 years old, builder of a $2.7 billion empire, built entirely on calculating the personal benefit in every situation, sat in his Central Park West penthouse and looked at photos of a woman whose life decision-making was the opposite of his own in every possible way, and understood something with a clarity that arrived like light through a window he hadn't known was closed. Elena Vasquez was a better person than he had ever been, and she was about to lose everything. He also found something else in his investigation, something that made Philip Saunders's management of the situation considerably more sinister than it had initially appeared. Philip had done more than advise James to stay silent. He'd quietly arranged a meeting with the contracting office's senior procurement officer, had suggested that Callaway Industries' silence on, quote, politically sensitive matters connected to certain federal enforcement actions would be appreciated. The procurement officer had understood completely. The to-be contract renewal had been tacitly linked to James staying quiet about Elena. His board had traded a woman's freedom and her children's mother for a government contract. In October 2023, a journalist from the New Jersey Advocate named Sarah Chen published a story about Elena Vasquez. Someone from the hospital had tipped her off, a nurse who knew Elena and knew about James, and couldn't stay quiet about the injustice of a woman facing deportation after saving a billionaire's life. The story was precise and devastating. It described Elena's CPR on the collapsed man in Corridor 7, described her removal order, described her children, described her appeal that was running out of time. The story didn't name James initially. It called him a wealthy businessman. But within 24 hours, Social media had identified him from the medical transport records that were semi-public. His name was everywhere. And with his name came the question that every person who read the story was asking, what is James Calloway going to do? His phone rang so many times he turned it off. His email crashed with incoming messages. His communications team issued a statement that said Calloway Industries respected the privacy of individuals involved in sensitive legal matters and had no comment at this time. It was the kind of non-statement that said everything about a man's character in 12 careful words. His board convened an emergency meeting. Philip Saunders laid out the situation. The story was manageable. Stay quiet. Let it cycle through the news. Don't engage. The Advocate was a regional paper. The story would be picked up for a day or two, and then something else would take over. The contract would be fine. James would be fine. Elena Vasquez would be deported to a country she'd left to escape violence. Her American-born children would either go with her or lose their mother, and Calloway Industries would continue being a $2.7 billion enterprise that made its decisions exactly the way it always had. Philip presented it as the rational choice, as the business choice, as what leadership looked like. James listened to the entire presentation, said nothing throughout, looked at the faces around the table, 12 people who collectively managed a multi-billion-dollar company and who were collectively preparing to do nothing while a woman who had saved James's life was destroyed by a system that saw her only as a violation. He left the meeting without comment. His board assumed this meant agreement. They'd seen his silence before. It almost always meant yes. What James did that night was drive to Newark. He drove himself, which he hadn't done in 3 years. He drove to the neighborhood where Elena lived in a 2-bedroom apartment with her children and her mother. He didn't knock on the door. He didn't have that right. Instead, he sat in his car outside a building he'd never entered and thought about 2 lives and the distance between them and why that distance had felt so natural for so long. Then he called his personal attorney, not the firm that represented Calloway Industries, but the attorney who drafted his wills and his personal trusts, a woman named Carol Marks who had known him for 20 years and was perhaps the only person in his professional life whose advice came without agenda. He told her everything. She listened for 45 minutes without interrupting. When he finished, she said, "James, what do you want to do?" "The right thing," he said. "I want to do the right thing." "Then I can help you with that. But understand what it costs. The board will move against you. The contract will be at risk. This is not going to be comfortable." Elena Vasquez spent 4 minutes on her knees keeping me alive when it cost her nothing, but it was still the right thing to do. I think I can manage uncomfortable. "James, have you ever testified before Congress?" "No." "Well," she said, "you're about to." Elena's case had attracted the attention of Senator Maria Lopez of New Jersey, who sat on the subcommittee on immigration enforcement. The senator had requested an emergency hearing focused on the increasing deportation of long-term residents with deep community ties and no criminal history. She'd made Elena's case the centerpiece, and when her office reached out to James Calloway's attorney about the possibility of his testimony, Carol had said yes before they finished the sentence. On April 8, 2024, James walked into the Senate hearing room carrying 2 things: a prepared statement that Carol and her team had spent 3 weeks writing, and a decision that had been hardening inside him since July of the previous year. His board had sent a legal representative, who arrived before James and spent 20 minutes communicating the board's expectations through James's corporate attorney. He was to express general humanitarian concern for immigration reform. He was to decline to discuss specific cases. He was to avoid any language that could be construed as criticizing the administration. He was to be sympathetic but not specific, and above all, not controversial. James listened to the instructions, thanked the legal representative, and opened the hearing room door. The room was full. Gallery packed with immigration advocates, journalists, Elena's supporters, people whose own family members faced similar situations. Cameras lined the walls. 6 senators sat at the elevated panel, Senator Lopez in the center. James took his seat, adjusted the microphone, looked at his prepared statement, and set it aside. Chairman Williams, Senator Lopez, members of the subcommittee, he began. My name is James Callaway. I'm the CEO of Callaway Industries. I'm here because on July 19, 2023, a woman named Elena Vasquez found me dying on the floor of St. Michael's Medical Center in Newark and chose to save my life. She didn't know who I was. She didn't calculate what my gratitude might be worth. She simply could not walk past a human being who needed help. He looked directly at the committee. His voice was steady. His board was watching on a live stream 40 stories above Manhattan, and he didn't care at all. Elena Vasquez is facing deportation. She has a final removal order. She has 2 American-born children, a 13-year-old and a 9-year-old, who have never been to Guatemala. She has lived in New Jersey for 11 years. She has worked. She has paid taxes. She has saved at least 1 life that I know of personally. He paused. I am here to tell you she should not be deported. Not because she saved me, though that matters more than I can explain, but because she is exactly the kind of person this country should be fighting to keep. She is brave and selfless and hardworking, and she has built a life here that should not be taken from her. Senator Lopez leaned forward. Mr. Callaway, your company is currently in negotiations for a significant federal contract. Has there been any pressure on you, professionally or politically, to refrain from making a statement like this? James looked at the camera. Yes. My board arranged an understanding with the federal contracting office that our continued silence on cases like Elena's would be appreciated in the context of our contract renewal. They traded her freedom for a business deal. I didn't know about it when they did it. I'm telling you about it now because the Senate should know that kind of arrangement is happening. The gallery erupted. The senators exchanged glances. The legal representative from his company's board stood up in the back of the room, face white as paper, and reached for his phone. James kept speaking. Elena Vasquez saved my life on a Wednesday night when she had no reason to and nothing to gain. I have spent 9 months trying to figure out what that obligates me to do. I think this is it. I think standing here and telling the truth, even if it costs me everything I've built, is the only appropriate response to what she did for me. He placed his prepared statement on the table and looked at the cameras. I would like to formally call on this subcommittee to grant Elena Vasquez humanitarian protection and a pathway to legal status. I would like to formally state that any federal contract contingent on the silence of private citizens about immigration cases is corrupt and should be investigated. And I would like to formally state that I am fully aware this testimony will likely result in my board removing me as CEO of Callaway Industries, and I have made my peace with that. The room was silent for exactly 4 seconds. Then it wasn't. What happened next moved faster than anyone anticipated. Senator Lopez submitted none. Emergency humanitarian protection request for Elena Vasquez the afternoon of James's testimony. Based on the public interest generated by the hearing and the documented evidence of corruption in the contracting arrangement, the request was approved within 72 hours. Elena was released from the ICE detention facility on April 11, 2024, walked out into afternoon light, and found her daughter Sofia and her son Miguel waiting on the other side of a chain-link fence. The 2B contract was not just at risk, it was cancelled. The Federal Contracting Office, now the subject of a congressional investigation following James's testimony, suspended the arrangement. 3 procurement officers were placed on administrative leave pending investigation. Philip Saunders resigned from Callaway Industries board before he could be pushed. 2 other board members who had participated in the arrangement stepped down within a week. James's board voted to remove him as CEO on April 14, 2024. James had anticipated this. He had spent the weeks before the testimony in consultation with Karl Marx, arranging the transfer of his personal shareholding and voting rights to a new structure that ensured the transition happened on his terms. He left Callaway Industries with his reputation transformed, his relationships rebuilt, and his personal net worth substantially intact. He established the Vasquez Foundation 3 months later, a legal defense fund for undocumented immigrants facing deportation who had demonstrated years of community contribution and had American-born children. The foundation's annual budget was $20 million, funded entirely by James. Within a year, it had provided legal representation for 437 families across 12 states. Elena Vasquez received legal permanent resident status in August 2024 under a humanitarian protection category. She continued working at St. Michael's Medical Center. She enrolled in the Community College Nursing Program in September 2024, supported by a full scholarship from the foundation. Sofia won a regional science competition and told a reporter that she still wanted to be a doctor. Miguel's asthma continued to be managed well with regular medical care. James Callaway visited St. Michael's Medical Center for the first time since his discharge on a Thursday morning in October 2024. He walked down Corridor 7. He stopped at the spot where he'd collapsed 15 months earlier and stood there for a moment. Then he found Elena on her shift, still cleaning with the same quiet efficiency. She saw him coming and smiled, the way her co-workers had always described, the kind that changes the character of whatever room she was standing in. They sat in the break room for 45 minutes and talked, not about what she'd done for him, or what he'd done for her, about her children, about her nursing program, about his plans for the foundation, about what he'd missed in his years of building an empire, and the clarity that came with losing most of it. About the strange economy of human lives, where a woman earning $18 an hour was immeasurably richer in the things that actually mattered than a man worth $2.7 billion. When James stood up to leave, Elena stopped him. She pressed something small into his hand. It was a prayer card, the kind sold in Catholic bookstores, with an image of the Virgin Mary on one side and a prayer in Spanish on the other. "My grandmother gave me this when I came to America," she said. "I kept it in my pocket every night I worked. I don't think I need it for the same reasons anymore. But I thought you might want something to carry." James looked at the card. He'd been raised in a family that went to church twice a year and used religion the way you use a formal suit, for occasions that required it. But he understood what Elena was offering him, something she valued, freely given. He put it in his pocket. He carried it every day after that. James Henry Callaway didn't rebuild his empire. didn't want to. He turned his attention to the foundation and to the work of understanding what he'd gotten wrong for 40 years and how to spend whatever years remained getting it closer to right. He sold the Tuscany villa and donated the proceeds. He kept the Montana ranch because it was where he went to remember who he was before he became who he'd been. He also started writing, though he never published what he wrote. He wrote about Elena and about July 19th, about what those 4 minutes and 12 seconds of CPR meant in the largest possible sense, about what it takes for a powerful man to truly reckon with the gap between what he's accumulated and what he's contributed, about the strange mercy of almost dying at the hands of someone who reminded him that life was supposed to be spent differently. He wrote that the most important transaction of his life wasn't a contract or an acquisition or a deal. It was a woman on her knees in a hospital corridor at 11:47 p.m., hands pressing against his sternum in the dark, counting out loud to keep a stranger's heart beating. And his only job, for whatever time he had left, was to be worth those 4 minutes and 12 seconds. Because here is what James Calloway understood that his board never did, and what every powerful person needs to understand before their moment of reckoning arrives: power is borrowed, wealth is temporary, empires dissolve. But what you do when someone's life is in your hands, when you have the ability to help and the choice of whether to use it, that is permanent. That is the record that doesn't get expunged when the contract expires or the company restructures or the stock price drops. Elena Vasquez had nothing when she knelt beside James in that corridor. No leverage, no calculation, no angle. She had only the decision that was fundamental to who she was, that you don't walk past someone who needs you just because helping them is inconvenient. James Calloway had everything when he sat before the Senate subcommittee, and he made the same decision. Not because it was strategically optimal, not because the math worked out, but because 40 years of choosing the profitable path over the humane one had brought him to a heart attack on a hospital floor, and he had been given the extraordinary gift of a second chance by the most unlikely of hands. He chose to deserve it. So ask yourself, what would you sacrifice for someone who saved your life? Not with money, which is easy when you have it, but with the things you've spent decades building, with your reputation, your position, your empire. Most of us will never face a choice that dramatic, but all of us face smaller versions of it every day. The moment when we could speak up for someone, but it would cost us something. The moment when we could act with humanity, but it might make things complicated. The moment when we could choose the right thing over the comfortable thing and feel the weight of that choice pressing against everything we've built. Elena Vasquez didn't hesitate for 1 second in that corridor. She just got on her knees and did what was right. And James Calloway, 62 years old and $2.7 billion, finally learned what that looked like and decided at the last possible moment to do the same. The most powerful thing a wealthy person can do isn't write a check. It isn't sit on the board of a charity. It isn't name a building or endow a scholarship. It's the moment when they look at their empire and say, none of this is worth more than doing the right thing. And then proving they mean it. James proved it in a Senate chamber in April 2024. Elena had proven it in a hospital corridor in July 2023. And somewhere between those two moments, those two lives, those two choices, made in completely different circumstances, by completely different people, with completely different amounts of power, was the whole story of what it means to be human. Choose to kneel when someone needs you. Choose to speak when staying silent, protects your empire, but abandons your soul. Choose to understand that what you build with your hands matters far less than what you protect with your courage. Choose to deserve your second chance. This story is a fictional dramatization inspired by real acts of heroism, by overlooked workers, real battles over immigration, humanity, and the real question of what obligations wealth creates when ordinary people save extraordinary lives. In a world that measures worth by net worth, choose to be like Elena and James. Choose the human being over the deal. Choose the right thing over the profitable thing. Choose grace even when it costs you everything. Choose to be worth saving.